Welcome to Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. A world where coming in second place is not an option, but where principle-centered winning is the only approach.
Good morning and welcome to Government Contracting Weekly. I'm Jim McCarthy, the owner of Key Solutions and the host of this show. Our regular viewers know that we end each program by thanking you for making Government Contracting Weekly a regular part of your learning regimen. Well, today's program is certainly all about learning as we offer a preview of the 33rd Annual NCMA Government Contract Management Symposium, or GCMS, which will be held in November in Washington, D.C. Joining me today are three panelists who have each played an integral role in making this year's GCMS a reality. First, let me introduce and welcome Charlie Williams, Jr., the president of C. Williams, LLC, and a member of the NCMA Board of Advisors. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Jim.
Welcome,
Glad
Charlie.
to be here.
Okay, good. Next, we have Dr. Terry Rainey. Dr. Rainey is the Senior Vice President and Group Manager of the Acquisition Support Group of CACI International. Terry is also on the NCMA Board of Advisors. Good morning to you, Terry.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. And then finally, we're happy to welcome back for a third time Jose Arrieta, the Procurement Ombudsman for the Department of Homeland Security. Jose played a vital role in helping to pull together this year's GCMS program while working closely with Dr. Nick Nyack, the former CPO for DHS. Welcome back, Jose.
Thank you, Jim. Glad to be here.
Good to have you here. I also note that both Charlie and Terry are former GCMS chairs, which for 2014 will be chaired by Jeff Kosis, the General Services Administration's Senior Procurement Executive. Okay, well, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's get right to it. Okay, gentlemen? So, this past November, NCMA had a major conference. I think it's called World Congress. You have a number of speakers. I noted that Wes Bush of Northrop Grumman, former Congressman Tom Davis, the iconic Norm Augustine, Deborah Lee, the Air Force Secretary, and others. So there was a lot of high-powered talent in that room. What was the buzz on the floor, so to speak? What were people talking about? What were the news? We'll start with you, Charlie.
Yeah, Jim. First of all, let me say I think we had a wonderful World Congress, one of the largest we've ever had in NCMA. And I think there were two pretty much themes that you heard out of the conference. One, the focus on the workforce, continued focus on the acquisition workforce that everyone believes is important as we go through the challenging times that we're facing in federal government procurement. And then secondly, I think the issue about affordability and cost reduction and how do we manage in this time where budgets are constrained and the continued thought that those budgets are going to continue to be constrained as we move into the future. So I really think it was a great conference, and those were two key focus areas that we looked at.
Terry, what would be your answer to that question? What did you learn and hear about?
A lot of people were really happy about the fact that we were having a large conference. We've been through a couple of years where, due to budget constraints and things, conferences have not been as well attended. So we were very pleased. It's actually the largest World Congress we've ever had. And then in Washington, a lot of folks, particularly government folks, enjoying coming to it because without the travel and things like that, it made it much easier. So, about 2,200 attendees. So it was really a great conference down at the Gaylord. I would say the other couple of areas, like Charlie, certainly affordability and the workforce are always main issues. But another couple of ones really are about the questions around compliance and the impact that's having on industry. Certainly there was a lot of talk about that. And then also just sort of the issues of the budget and where we're going and the uncertainty that's still out there from the sequestration and from the shutdown last year. And that's still on the minds of a lot of people, both in industry and government, about where we go next and how that's going to be. It looks like this year we're certainly not going to have the same situation we did last year, but it's still an area where uncertainty is a factor for both government and industry folks.
Okay, well, great. Hoping that they haven't stole your thunder, Jose. What was your takeaway?
I think that there was one very interesting thing about this World Congress. You had half industry and half government, and I think the key takeaway for me is that 30% of the acquisition workforce is going to retire within 5 years or can retire. 30% of the acquisition workforce has less than 5 years of experience. So how do you train people to be smarter and faster? You give them experiences where they can engage in a safe environment on the tough challenges they're going to face throughout their career. And that's by bringing industry to the table and having them learn directly with industry. Whether it's based on case studies or a panel discussion. So I thought NCMA, that's a new trend that I hope to see continue in government. The other thing that I thought was very telling is, and the Secretary of the Air Force said this, her advice to the younger acquisition professionals, and the conference seemed to be focused on younger acquisition professionals, was zig and zag throughout your career. We're no longer in the time we're spending 10 years as a contracting professional and then becoming a senior executive and spending another 10 years as a senior executive is the way to build a career. You have to be a contracting professional. You got to get time as a program manager, spend some time as a core.
You have a lot of tickets to punch, so to speak.
Yeah, it's important to zig and zag and broaden your experience so you can holistically look at the function of acquisition if you're going to have an impact in the future. So those are the two takeaways from my perspective.
Well, they all sound like good topics. I think you mentioned this acquisition workforce, and we hear a lot about it. In fact, it's often not in the best terms. The acquisition workforce needs to be upgraded. They need to be trained. They need to be hired, additional folks. Does the acquisition workforce, by and large, agree with that themselves? Do they think they're that they need anything done especially for them? What do you think?
Well, I absolutely think they do. I think that the acquisition workforce would tell you that over the years they've been somewhat neglected, and we've lost the opportunity to put the training behind the workforce that's required. I think Jose mentioned the fact that we've got to develop different ways of training people so we can get people trained faster and quicker, given the environment that we're working with and as it changes so quickly. They definitely believe that there are some things that could be done and done better.
So in your view, the workforce itself realizes that there could be some improvements, not just the pundits and the commentators. Is that your thought too? Basically the same thing?
Yeah, but I'd like to make the point that the acquisition workforce clearly is addressed towards the government acquisition workforce, but you have to remember there's another side of that table, and that table there needs to be a lot of communication between the two, and there needs to be equal capabilities into both the government and industry for that exchange to be meaningful, programs to be managed well. So there's a lot of acquisition workforce challenges in terms of industry as well, in contracting, program management, systems engineering, all those kind of areas that both government, industry supports government, and then government depends upon industry to produce. And so it is a challenge. There's that same kind of a bathtub effect. Charlie and I use that term from our days working together in the Air Force, when we had a bathtub effect where you had all these retirees and things, and then suddenly you had a bimodal situation with a lot of young folks and a lot of old folks. Older folks, not old, and some present company excluded. But the point being that it is a challenge for both industry and government, and I think that came across. The other thing at the conference, though, a lot of talk about communication with industry, and I think there's between government and industry, and there's a real recognition on the part of a good thing both in terms of government and industry that there needs to be that kind of open exchange, or we're just simply not going to get things, to deal with the budget uncertainty, the constraints we have without that level of communication.
So one thing I want to, 1 in 5 acquisition professionals get 5 years of experience, get their training, and they leave and go to the private sector. That's a fact. So obviously you have younger acquisition professionals that want that experience. If you think about the training curriculum for acquisition professionals, and I literally have been in government 10 years, I've gone through the entire thing recently, a ton of training in procurement law, ton of training in public policy, you live in your mission space every day. You'd never receive any training in industry. How can you spend $550 billion a year and not have any training in how the costs associated with putting together a bid and proposal? How can you not have any training on how market convergence, the intersection of the professional services market and the information technology market, and how that's changing the structure of contracts? No talk about that at all, and I think he hit it on the head. When there needs to be a dialogue on those topics, and the workforce needs to be educated on the trends that are impacting our business model.
Perfect. Okay, well, we're going to step away right now, Troy, if you don't mind. When we come back, we've been talking about the past conference. We're going to talk about one that's coming up because it's very exciting. We'll be right back after this.
Okay.
So did we win that government contract?
We did.
And?
And now we've got to deal with the regulatory hurdles.
Well, good luck with that.
When the government's your client, you need to play by their rules.
And the rules change more than you think.
Exactly. We need someone who's done this before. Plus, it's complicated, so we're going with BDO.
BDO.
People who know government contracting know BDO.
Working in contract management is a complex job. Creating, executing, managing contracts. It's an ever-changing world, and our members share the same challenges. At the National Contract Management Association, we know this business, gathering the best minds in our field, furthering your career by providing knowledge and training. Together, we've figured it out.
Welcome back to Government Contracting Weekly. Charlie, before we went to break, I kind of cut you off. What was your thought that you wanted to make?
Yeah, Jim, I just wanted to close out on the point that Terry and Jose were making regarding the importance of the collaboration between the government and industry team, both from a training perspective as well as from a communication perspective. This is one big whole that's required to ultimately get successful products delivered and services delivered to the customers that we're trying to deliver them to. So I just wanted to emphasize that point, that it's absolutely critical that we learn how to work together, train together, and then deliver products
That
together.
linkage is important.
It's critical.
Okay, so now, Terry, I want to ask you this question. We talked about the past conference. Now let's talk about the future conference in November, the GCMS thing. If you had to look in your crystal ball, what would you say would be the main topics on the floor for the November conference?
Well, bottom of the floor, I think a lot of people will be wondering about the election, because the conference is actually going to be one of the election day, held on election day as well, which was also true a couple of years ago. So that will, by definition, will be a big part of the conversation. What's going to happen? How will that influence things? Usually, that session of the GCMS usually has a lot more around things around regulation, statutory changes, those kind of things, how they're going to affect everything. And so I know there's going to be several panels on that, so you'll see a lot of that discussion. I know we in industry are looking for the government to do a lot more for FY15 going forward in terms of acquisition reform. The staffers and things that have talked to us have indicated they see the next year being a more active year, a non-election year, in terms of acquisition reform legislation. Things are looking at some of the stuff that's already being talked about. So I think that's going to be a main topic of coverage as it comes out. How's it going to be implemented, and the impact on both government and industry.
Okay, well, good. Jose?
One of the things I'm interested in seeing at GCMS is they brought in a speaker named Bob Cecina, and he's a former president of American Express Bank, president of Citigroup Bank. And he's going to talk about lessons learned. And his thought is, look, in private industry, we make investments and some work and some don't. But we learn lessons from them through a certain process. And his thought is, the government workforce has to start looking at their process, looking at failures, and looking back at them. How can we improve them in the future? And I think that's a little bit different in terms of a speaker, in terms of a topic for GCMS. So I think that'll be really interesting. The other thing that I'm really interested in hearing is we have Tom Linton from Flextronics and Christopher Brown from World Bank coming in. And Christopher Brown manages about a $31 billion portfolio of investments. They're building, for the World Bank, they're building the largest metro system in the world, the largest train system in the world from a procurement perspective. He's advising countries on how to establish procurement function. And Tom Linton manages a global supply chain that provides supply chain support to Fortune 500 companies, over 300 of them, 26 billion in services. And what they do is they use analytics so they can actually shift the supply chain. They use predictive analytics so they can shift the supply chain based on disruptions like the tsunami in Japan. So I think that'll be two topics that I'll be looking forward to hearing more about.
And they strike me as not the typical people who attend this conference, so it's going to be a good way of getting a different sort of perspective, right?
To bring a different perspective.
Yeah, okay. Terry, what mood do you think will exist? I mean, what will contractors' mood be on the floor? Will they be depressed? will they be resigned? Will they be
by nature, right? No, you've already got it. No, I don't think we'll be depressed. I think having some stability in a budget and things that not going through what we did through last year, I think will be reason for some joy and happiness on some people's parts. I think so. That's there. I think it will be. I think a lot of people in the industry would be glad to see the kind of speakers there, because I think one of our biggest frustrations is and the World Bank is a great example of this, of a difference in understanding about risk. Risk management is something that government and industry just seem to look at it differently. They fundamentally do, and consequently, it tends to, I believe, in the government, it tends to be mostly about how do I avoid risk or how do I reduce it, where in fact in industry it's about figuring out what risk you can take, and certainly that would be the case with somebody building a, at the World Bank or those kind of organizations. So I think there'll be a lot of those kind of areas of interest.
Charlie, let me ask you this question. Do you feel that we will be facing continued budget uncertainty, or do you think that's behind us?
Is there a time when we won't be facing continued budget uncertainty? How many times have you heard calls for budget stability as a key parameter in making acquisition
Ain't
work?
going to happen. Huh?
And I don't see it happening. Now I want to go back, though, to this comment about how industry will think. I continuously hear from industry colleagues this continued worry about acquisition. How much more legislation is there going to be in the acquisition space? How much more regulation that's going to burden the system, that's going to slow the system down and maybe potentially add more costs? I think industry continuously attempts to try to insert themselves in a way of saying, we've got to figure out a way to manage this beast, and more acquisition regulations and legislation may not be the answer. In fact, maybe we need some relief in certain areas, and I'm hoping everyone will, we're going to have John Etherton there, who's going to talk a little bit about what's going on over the Hill and Mac Thornberry's committee. So,
and I want to talk a little bit about John on our next segment. We're going to have to step away again. I know time flies quick, gentlemen, but when we come back, we will continue this discussion. Thank you.
What do you want for your business? If you're a federal contractor, your likely answer is to win. But winning these days is harder to do as the market has become increasingly competitive and demands that you do much more with much less. Hi, I'm Lauren LaMarche, a certified professional coach and proposal manager. At KSI, we believe your key to winning lies in developing your proposal team. Integrating our leadership coaching services into your existing proposal process can help you create a winning team that will give you a competitive edge and increase your win probability. For 30 years, we've helped the top 10 federal contractors and hundreds of smaller firms win over $130 billion in federal business. So, do you really want to win? If your answer is yes, then invest in your people. You can't afford not to. Contact me at ksileadershipcoaching.com because you need to win.
Okay, Terry, here's a question. There's a lot of talk about acquisition reform. There's talk about new regulations, revisions to the FAR, everything else. Is it possible that it's the regulation itself that is the problem? Are we over-regulated? Has it become really the cause of our problems?
Well, no. I mean, I don't think the federal acquisition regulations are the problem. Now, full disclosure, I was the member of the Air Force member of the Defense Acquisition Regulations Council for 3 years, and so I have a lot of experience in that. And clearly, the FAR, to a large degree, is written around what you're implementing that Congress has told us, or the executive branch or whatever, in terms of what's needed. And many times every year, the National Defense Authorization Act or whatever, you're implementing statutes. Right. And the issue is not the regulations. I don't believe that at all. The real issue here is it just keeps coming. And there's examples where then how do you determine when is that straw that's going to cause the camel's back to sag? And there are a couple of examples now where, in fact, the industry is looking at it, and government as well, and saying, how do we do that? I mean, one is and it adds cost. One is the counterfeit parts rule. That's, the statute is there, the statute is written a certain way, it's being implemented, and yet both people in government and industry are saying, how do we do that? How do we really implement that? And the risk, as I mentioned earlier, that industry is seeing is just continually increasing because we don't know how to really assess it and manage it. Another one is the business systems rule that Charlie's very familiar with from 2 or 3 years ago, that when he was in government was getting lots of phone calls and visits from companies like us saying, this is going to be a substantial increase in cost and things. And you're seeing industry folks come out and speak about that. I mean, just as an example, CACI, my company, our CEOs, our last 2 CEOs, Paul Cafone and our current one, Ken Asbury, and our chairman of the board, Jack London, have all been at GCMS and have all spoken at the GCMS. And a common theme in every case is the regulations and how do we in industry, how do we implement it and do it in a cost-effective way.
So Charlie, okay, are we overregulated?
See, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Terry. I mean, I'm not sure that anybody knows it's not the regulation. I believe that is indeed the problem. The fact that we continuously put regulation in place, continuously put legislation in place, and no one goes and assesses the impact of that regulation. I think a good example that Mr. Kendall's doing in DoD acquisition is to try to assess the impact of the various changes that we're making in policy and process. And I think until you do that, you really don't know whether or not the regulations that you formulate and put in place are making a difference. So, so I believe that we may be.
Okay, could be. Let me throw out a little story for you. Back in the late 70s, at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, at it's called the West Hackberry site, a fire broke out, and they had to put the fire out. And so they couldn't ask for RFPs, they couldn't do all this, so they called in a company. It was called Boots and Coots that put out fires. And when Boots and Coots arrived, the contracting officer gave them this big contract and said, okay, well, before you can start, you got to sign it. And Boots, I think it was Boots, said, I ain't signing that. And he started to walk away. So the contracting officer got, well, what am I going to do? We got to put this fire out. So Boots came back, he grabbed a clipboard, and he says, put fire out. And he signed it, and that was his contract. Can we get back to more of that?
I want to throw a curveball at you guys because we're talking about regulation, but I think there's something different happening in the marketplace, and it goes to somewhat to your point, Jim. So it used to be you had MOBA schedule for services and consulting, and you had the IT-70 schedule for information technology. Those two marketplaces have started to merge, and as they merge, it creates challenges for business models in the private sector and for how the government contracts for things. Those challenges are what drive a lot of the acquisition issues that happen. And then we have regulation that gets poured on top to try to address those challenges. And I think there needs to be a more robust discussion around what is the new business model for how we do business with a marketplace that's now a combination of professional services and IT services. It's different.
Okay, we're going to take a break now, and when we come back, what I actually want to do is talk about trade associations, specifically NCMA, and its role in this whole process. We'll be right back.
AFCEA has been bringing government and industry together since 1946. By joining AFCEA, you will reach the decision makers and become part of the discussion. You'll increase market visibility, gain market insight, receive discounts on AFCEA member services and events, and manage and engage corporate associates. AFCEA is the association of choice. Join today at www.afcea.org.
Question for you. Do you lack an overall effective win strategy? Hi, I'm Jim McCarthy, owner of Key Solutions. For over 30 years, KSI has helped clients win or retain over $130 billion in government contracts by providing the keys to winning. Now, if you're chasing a must-win contract, visit aockeysolutions.com and click on Contact Us. It's a tough market. Don't go it alone. Okay, it's time to talk about our last message. If you had one thing you want our audience to take away from today's show, what do you think it would be?
Markets are converging. The business model of old for doing business, the government is changing, contract model and on the private side. And I think that private industry needs to look at their model strategically and think how they can offer services based on the new marketplace that exists.
Okay, very good. Terry, what would be your one thing?
Jose's absolutely right, and I would just say that you're seeing solutions and services sort of merging together and becoming very, very intertwined. And with that, with those market changes and everything else that's going on, again, I make the point that industry and government just need to figure out how to talk better to each other. The leadership on both sides really needs to make an effort to engender that, and that means encouraging attendance at like GCMS and things like that to make that happen, providing those venues.
And you know that one of the purposes of this show is to actually foster communication between government and contractors. So hopefully we're doing that. Right. Your one thing.
Yeah, as I used to tell folks in the organizations I led, Jim, it's all about the workforce. We've got to develop them, train them, and mentor them. And frankly, GCMS is a kind of conference that allows that to happen in many different ways, and I think it's one that people need to consider.
Okay. All right, well, before we wrap up, we've come to that portion of the show where we like to answer some timely questions that our industry often poses. Here's my colleague, Richard Nathan, answering the question, Is the worst over?
It seems as though at every meeting I go to these days, half the people there ask me if the worst is over. Have we turned the corner? Can we now expect improved market conditions? You know, this whole situation reminds me of the early news coverage of the disappearance of the Malaysian airliner. Everyone became a pundit and everyone had an opinion, but almost no one would admit that they really had no information on which to create an informed opinion. Of course, that didn't stop them from giving it to you. I will not be one of those opinionated pundits shouting platitudes without information. I encourage all our viewers to watch developments carefully, with an open mind, and be prepared to adjust course quickly as the truth comes out. Meanwhile, use this time to strengthen your organizations, develop your people, upgrade your systems, and generally see to those things you should have done before but were too busy to tackle. Eventually, the new normal will become apparent and you will be ready to thrive in that environment, whatever it is. If you have an opinion about the state of the market and would like to share it with our viewers, go to governmentcontractingweekly.com and click on Inquiries and Comments on the top of the page. We may read some of the more interesting comments on the air. Key Solutions is here to help you win or retain your next contract. If you have a question, you can also use the Inquiries button to get our attention with a call for help.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. But to our viewers at home, if you haven't yet registered for this year's GCMS on November 3rd and 4th, you can still do so now by going to the NCMA website and clicking on events. I want to thank our panel for joining me today. First of all, Jose Arrieta, the Procurement Ombudsman for the Department of Homeland Security. Thank you very much, Jose.
Thank you, Jim, and I'm really excited now to attend the NCMA GCMS. I hope to see you all there.
Yeah, me too, as a matter of fact. And then next, Dr. Terry Rainey, the Senior Vice President and Division Group Manager of the Acquisition Support Group of CACI International and a member of the NCMA Board of Advisors. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you very much for having me, and just like Jose, it's going to be a great conference, but it's a training symposium and it's a great opportunity for industry and government to train together, and that should be a main message for going.
And last but not least, Charlie Williams Jr., the president of C. Williams LLC and a member of the NCMA Board of Advisors and the Board of Directors. Thank you as well, Charlie. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim, and much continued success with your show.
Thank you very much. But most importantly, I want to thank you, our viewers, for once again making Government Contracting Weekly a regular part of your learning regimen. On behalf of all my colleagues at Key Solutions, I'm Jim McCarthy, and I'll see you next week.
You've been watching Government Contracting Weekly, sponsored each week by AOC Key Solutions Incorporated. Government Contracting Weekly is the only television program devoted exclusively to the competitive and dynamic world of government contracting. For additional information, comments, questions, or suggestions, please write us at governmentcontractingweekly.com.